going to shoot a little bull, so I wore my matador's cape. Well, I mean, if you're going to throw a lion to the Christians, why wear your martyr's colors. There, we're going to talk about coping. Those of you who are acquainted with my lecture style know I disrobe as I talk. If we get into sex, I may divest myself. From the time you and I were born, we were developing our coping mechanisms. Some people would probably say even before we were born. But I would contend, I'll be conservative about it and say from the moment we were born. There we were, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 22 inches long, thrust into the world. A highly stressful event. It stressed Mommy, it stressed the doctor, it stressed Daddy, and it stressed us. And from the moment we were lying there in the crib, this totally helpless being, supposedly, we confronted one of our first coping tasks as we looked at the giants lumbering around the room. And the task was how to get them to obey. When they didn't even speak our language and were 20 times our size. And we had to get them educated to dealing with our needs, to meeting our needs, and do things that they didn't even do for themselves, like get up at 2 in the morning to feed us, or to change dirty diaper. And our ability to control that universe, which is basically what we're about when we're talking about coping, which began then. Our task at that time of relating to them was the beginning of the way in which we started to create ourselves as the beings we are in the world. A creative task that goes on at this moment is going on all the time you and I are alive. And a lot depends on how successful we were at that coping task and at dealing with the stresses of that birth event and afterwards, the life event that's still going on. And it was stressful for Mommy, Daddy, us, as baby. Any siblings we had found it stressful also. And we have to talk a little bit about stress when we talk about coping. Because when we talk about the attempt to live a life of quality that feels good by meeting the stuff that hits us, we're talking basically about how we handle stress. Now, most people, when you say stress, they only think in negative terms. They think stress is a bad thing. Now, I have to disabuse you of that, because the fact is that if you had not been stressed, you would not have arrived here today. You were stressed on getting out of bed this morning. If you were not stressed by the other drivers on the freeway, you would have been killed by one of them. You see, all of that alertness that you had, all of that tension that you feel was a creative tension that brought you here. But everything depends on how we handle this thing called stress. And when you think of it only in terms of it's bad, we call that distress, which comes from a Greek word which means bad. In fact, if you read your Dante, you'll find the city of Dis, which is at the center of the Inferno of Dante, is a cake of ice, and it's called the city of Dis, D-Y-S, Greek for bad. Okay, you got that? Now, but there's another form of stress, you see, which is called eustress, and eustress, eu comes from a Greek word which means good. It's where we get the word euphoria. Good feelings, okay? Eustress. Now, why do I mention that? Because the very same event that you may find wonderfully elevating and eustressful may be very distressing to me. You see? There are people who literally go and ride roller coasters. They actually go out and get on these things voluntarily When I brought two of my kids to Disneyland one time when I was appearing in Anaheim, I brought two of my kids to Disneyland, and I sent them over there while I was talking in the arena, and then the next day they were to show me Disneyland because I had never been there. The very first thing they did was to put me on the Matterhorn. This was meant to be an experience that would improve me. They were going to, it was a religious experience. Made me holy. Scared the hell out of me. I prayed a lot while I was on it. And when I landed, I thanked God I was alive. But there are literally people who do it without any coercion from their children. But you see, what I found as a distressful event, there are people, I saw a couple on one of the evening talk shows once who travel the country and they ride on every roller coaster they can find. There are other people who literally jump out of airplanes. They go up in an airplane and they jump out of this airplane and they float around in the air for a long while before they pull a ripcord and hope the chute opens. They will tell you that they do this because it is exhilarating, it is exciting, it is thrilling. They can't wait to get up there and do it again. I don't do it because I think it would be distressing. You could throw me out of an airplane with 3 parachutes on and I would not call it exciting. So the event that may stress us, what for you may be a creative, energizing, thrilling, exciting thing, you see, like skydiving, might be for somebody else a very scary, threatening, upsetting event. You have to understand that. So the event's the same. Our attitude towards it matters. And that's so about most of life. It is far less important what hits us than it is how you and I choose to respond to it, how we interpret it, how we look at it. Okay? And from the time we were little kids, we began to interpret the world as a friendly or an unfriendly place. And some of us may have picked up some bad habits in viewing the world, so that we end up with barriers to good communications with others, which we'll talk about in the second segment of this program. Barriers to appreciating ourselves properly, low self-esteem, low self-image, you name it. Or other things that hamper our full enjoyment of life from moment to moment. Because, very early on, for example, we start learning things like how to put foot in mouth. I learned that very well. I do that every so often, even now. And that was a stressful event. Later on, it became very stressful for us to learn 2 plus 2, and we bit our tongue, 2 plus 2, and we hoped for a good grade on the exam that had 2 plus 2 in it, and 1 plus 3, and 4 plus 9. You remember those? Yeah, big deal, weren't they? You didn't have any trouble right now with them, did you? No, not stressful at all. Or we were real stressed learning to tie our shoes. Now, this gentleman and I are in the same boat. We ended up with zippers. We no longer stress ourselves with tying our shoes. But in coping with the giants, we learned a lot of ways, that sometimes hamper us in the present, in coping with life in the present. For example, if we had a parent who was a perfectionist about us, we may find ourselves very hard on ourselves and perfectionist ourselves, and very hard on the people around us, and never anything satisfying us, because we got this sort of parental control in there that keeps us dissatisfied. We never did anything good enough. If we had an alcoholic parent, we may very well end up choosing to have relationships with workaholics or alcoholics because we find chaotic relationships are ones we learned how to cope with. But if somebody's nice, steady, reliable, loving towards us, we don't know how to handle them. We didn't learn how to cope with them, and so we think they're dull. See? That's right, yeah. Or we'll tend to be alcoholics ourselves, or we'll tend to lead, chaotic sort of lives, because that was what we grew up with and learned how to cope with, and we feel comfortable coping with that later. Okay, still with me? If we had a very coercive parent, And we learned how to cope with that coercion in asserting our freedom. The basic way we learned how to cope for most of us was procrastination. So if you're a procrastinator now, you might want to look at whether or not your parent was a coercive parent. Or if you're a passive-aggressive person, which means driving somebody else crazy by what you don't do. That generally comes out of somebody who was coerced early on, and they didn't have much. You don't have much power when you're this big. So the only power you have, you learn very early on. You got one power. Unfortunately, a lot of people get it erased. But you see, for the first 18 months to 2 years of your life, there's one powerful word that the giants use a lot. No. No, you can't put your finger in the light socket. No, you can't pull the hot water over on yourself. No, you can't pull the tablecloth off the table. No, you can't. You see, and then you reach age 2, and you're able to locomote. You're moving around on your own steam. And this is called discovering your autonomy. And the parent says, do this. And you say, no. This is known as the terrible twos. Now, at this point, there's a conflict of wills between parent and you, and the parent, being bigger, usually wins, saying things to little girls like, nice little girls don't say no. But very often we get the no crushed out of us at that age, and then we just, we have to find other ways of resisting, and we do it by, yes, I'm coming, and not coming. Mommy's calling us to dinner. Yeah, coming. Go right on with what we're doing. Drives them crazy, Okay. That's called passive-aggressive behavior. Okay. Anyway, the stresses of our life depend upon how we interpret them. So that, for example, not long ago, I had a 17-and-a-half-year-old youngster brought to me, senior in high school. He was going to kill himself. His mother sat downstairs. She had brought him over because the teacher had discovered he was going to kill himself, and the teacher had called the mother and told her to bring him over to me, and so she brought him over to me, and he was going to kill himself because, one, he had 3 sets of friends, and none of them liked the kind of music he liked. That was the first item. That's major. See, he didn't feel like he belonged anywhere. 2, his parents were fighting, and his father was probably going to leave his mother and marry his mistress. Okay. The third item was that he didn't have a girlfriend, and the fourth one was that his grades were suffering, see, and the teachers were down on him. Now, 3 weeks later, we graduated him. Okay? Without drugs, without seeing him 3 times a week, without saying to him for 6 years. 3 weeks later, we graduated him. And what he said on graduation is the reason I'm telling you about him. Because he said, nothing has changed in my life. What has changed entirely is my attitude toward what's going on. Now, how had we changed his attitude? Well, it was very simple. I asked him what a leader was. What's a leader? He had to really wrestle with that. He never thought about what leadership was, see? And we talked about that a bit, and we finally came to the conclusion that a leader was a person who didn't follow the crowd, see? Politicians become leaders by finding out where the crowd goes and getting in front of it as fast as they can. But for a real leader is one who follows his own way, and we pointed out that he was in the avant-garde of the music world. See? That his friends didn't like his music just meant that they were slow. See, they weren't in the leadership position. That was item 1. 2, we discovered who was responsible for his parents' marriage. He wasn't. His parents were. His responsibility was to love each of them. That's all. To take as good care of each of them as he could. They had to deal with their own problems. So we found out who owned that problem, right? You still with me? Yeah. Third one was, well, he didn't have a girlfriend. Why didn't he have a girlfriend? You see, because who's going to go out with a depressed nerd? And furthermore, he was getting lousy grades, and he was getting lousy grades because if he was going to kill himself, what good are grades going to be? Now, once we got all that in perspective, you see, then he had a different attitude towards it. And so he said, nothing has changed in my life. I'm getting better grades, he said. He was doing better in school. But what has changed entirely is my attitude towards it. It's very important because many of you have probably had Psych 101 somewhere or whatever it's called these days, and you remember a very famous picture. It's a black and white sketch, and it's a picture of two faces at a window or of a chalice. Take your choice. Or there's another one, equally famous, of an ugly old hag right out of Macbeth, one of the three crones that the witches brew there, or it's a beautiful young Edwardian lady looking off to the right, as I recall. The picture is just a sketch. They're black and white, and everything depends on whether you put the light up front or the shadows up front in your view of it. Now, reality, if you can change a picture, you see, that is right there, concrete, there it is. You can make it totally different. I've had people, I show them that picture, you know, and they can't see the ugly old hag. And their wife sees the ugly old hag right away, see? And then they can't see the ugly old hag. And then they'll come in every week for, you know, as long as they're, oh, let's see that picture again. Trying to see the other person. They keep putting one thing up front, and it changes their view. You see, and once it depends on what you're viewing. You have a different view of a chalice than you might have of two faces at a window that are looking like this. Yeah, different emotional response. So he had a different emotional response to what was going on in his life because of what we put up front, in the forefront of his experience. We can do that for ourselves too. Okay. Now, the reason I go into this is because the stressful events that we have to cope with in our life, we have to then begin to examine. We begin to examine how we're approaching them, how we're viewing them, and sometimes when our view of them gets in the way, we have to seek competent help to get somebody to help us get a different view of what's going on here. Some people think that coping means you never have to ask anybody for help. That's the stupidest thing in the world. I don't know a darn thing about the motor on my car. If it breaks down, I am not being a real superb coper by sitting in it and waiting for it to start again. Calling a mechanic is proper coping, right? Okay. Competent coping, very often, the first rule of it is, if it seems to be out of my control or I'm not sure how to handle this, then maybe I ought to seek some counsel on it, you see. Okay. And competent counseling is one of the things we do to cope well. Another thing we do is to ask ourselves where certain of our attitudes come from, where we get this, how we're contributing to the situation, how we might handle it more positively or more constructively. Very, very important to understand that. Those are some of the first rules of competent coping with oneself. Because you see, what you and I bring to any relationship is us. How we're feeling about ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, our whole state of being at the moment, that's what we bring to any of our relationships and to the world. You're your own best gift to the world. You got that? Now, some people don't know that. I had a woman, she brought her husband in. He was a big one. Hey, someone get big ones, you know. She had a big one. Big one. And she was one of those dinky ones. You know, sometimes the dinky ones, they marry these big ones. And they had been married for 9 years, had 3 children. He had never been intimate. And, never talked. Never said a word. He didn't talk. Furthermore, he was probably going to lose his job because she learned from one of his colleagues at work he didn't communicate well with the other people at work either. And she was sick and tired of this lack of intimacy and lack of communication and lack of emotional support, and she was going to dump him. Now, you know, one of the interesting things I've discovered in my work is people are always going to dump people for the very same reasons they married them. Yeah, all the time that happened. She was going to dump him because he didn't talk. Do you know why she loved him? Why she was attracted to him to begin with? He was such a good listener. And not only was he a good listener, but he was a strong, silent, solid, dependable type. Yeah, it's true. Oh, yeah. I don't say things that ain't true. I get to use ain't because I write novels too, so I have a poetic license, you see, to do that with the language. Okay. So she was just raising Cain about this fellow, and finally when she, ran out of things to say, I turned to him, and he was sort of sulking there. And I said, well, what do you say about that? And he said, am just naturally shy. I said, oh, come on, I said. And I got up out of my chair and I came over and I looked at him. And I said, you do that very well. I don't think I've seen a natural shy done that well in maybe 10 years. Yeah, probably 10 years. Did you study old Gary Cooper movies to be that naturally shy? He said, I've always been this way. I said, no, you weren't always that way. Once upon a time, probably when you were little, you decided that in order to survive in the world, you had to be naturally shy. When did you make that decision to be naturally shy, to use that defense mechanism in order to cope with your world? And he gave one of those marvelously, peculiarly American answers. Comes out of the American educational institutions. I don't know. Little kids say it to their parents. We're always trapping little kids into saying it. Mothers do this a lot. Little one comes toddling in with jam all over her face. Have you been in the jam? Now, one thing you learned when you were a little kid in order to cope was you keep the giants happy. And what they don't know ain't going to hurt them, and she wouldn't ask that question if she had known you were in the jam, so you say, And then she says, well, how come you got all that jam on your face? I don't know. Spouses are always saying it to one another. Oh, I don't know. It's a quick way of ending the discussion. We say it to ourselves when we're beginning to explore some mystery about our own being. We say, well, I don't know. And we knock it right out and then close the curtain, and that's that. Now, I have, and I gave it in a different context, in a different series at one time, the absolutely, infallibly correct response to anybody, whether it's a client of mine or me or one of my kids or somebody I'm acquainted with who says, I don't know to me. I always use this response, and I never fail to get the correct answer. So I went over to the slumbering giant, and I said, when he said, I don't know. And I said, well, take a guess. Because you see, you can't guess wrong. You say, I was only guessing, you know. You can't be marked down as stupid. I was only guessing. And he said, well, I guess it was because both my parents were alcoholics and I was an only child, and they used to have violent fights and break furniture and throw things and smash things and threaten murder and divorce and everything else, and I used to hide under the bed or in the closet. I've never had anybody guess wrong. They go right back to... I said, yeah, I guess that probably is a reason, yeah. I suppose when you went to school, you know, that'd make me naturally shy fast too, see? I said, when you went to school, I bet you made a lot of friends. Oh, I couldn't make any friends because, you see, I'd have to bring them home to that, and I couldn't bring them home to that, and so I didn't make any friends. I said, well, that increased your natural shy. Tell me, where are your parents now? Well, Daddy's dead, and Mommy lives in Connecticut with her sister. And I said, and you live here in California with your wife and 3 children, and you're about to lose that family because you are using a defense mechanism that you got for coping with the world when you were growing up, that you no longer need, that's getting in the way of your effective functioning. How would you like to take 4 lessons from Clayton Barbeau on being naturally more gregarious? And he did. And now every year or so I get invited to one of those $150 a plate, you know, rubber chicken dinners. And yeah, they have them. It was for the poor. He does this wonderful work, and they have this annual banquet, and I always get these free tickets to it. And I'm sort of grandfathered in, because the guy who runs it is this man. And he raises a lot of money for good causes, and you see him at the door shaking hands with politicians and corporate officials and lawyers and judges and all kinds of people, and he introduces the talent, and he's the MC for the evening, and you'd never know he was naturally shy. In fact, you can't shut him up now. And he's too big for you to try. Now, a lot of us cop out. in terms of our coping with the world on the grounds that we're just naturally this way. I'm just naturally repugnant. You know, we face all kinds of stresses. We have a lot of external stresses out there in the world, the terrorist stress, the hijacking stress, all those headlines things, they stress us. The environmental pollution stress, the traffic, all of those things, just what goes on in the external world over which we have very little control. But we also have internal stresses that we self-generate, and a lot of them are totally unnecessary. They're what we tell ourselves, they're the way we interpret the world to ourselves, and they interfere with our effective functioning, you see. And those are the ones we have quite a bit of control over. I'm glad I looked at my notes. I almost forgot to tell you that. But the attempt to, when we have a panic reaction, you want to hold those? The panic reaction that some of us have at times, you know, is an example of stress reaching its utmost. For example, when we get really frightened, something is like the roller coaster is an adrenal flush for this reason. We get really scared, and the adrenaline pumps out into the system, and it does a lot of things. One of the things it does is it causes the liver to shoot a lot of glucose into the bloodstream. Did you know that? Yeah, it enriches the blood for quick energy. Then the heart beats faster to get the blood throughout the system so we can fight or run real fast. Yeah, and then the respiration rate increases so that we can oxygenate that blood, and we lose our appetite for food and for sex. Yeah. Ask anybody who's been making love when there's an unexpected knock on the door. Yeah. And all of that is to gear us for, as Hans Selye, the foremost expert on stress, who died just a few years ago, has said after years and years of his work, that was to prepare us for running or fighting. And most of that's inappropriate these days, so we get ourselves all stressed up sometimes in those reactions to the world. I had a woman client, for example, who would panic herself. She could not drive at night, and one of the problems was, in order to move ahead in her profession, in her job, she was to take a specific course at a community college, which was a night course. And getting in her car at night was an absolute dreadful experience for her. She was just petrified, and the fact that she did it once or twice before she sought me out is a testimony to her courage. But she was just scared witless about it. She came in to see me, and I mean, it was a real panic. I mean, just her whole body was geared for in this whole fearful thing that we just described, the panic reaction sort of thing. And when she came in, we learned where that came from. You see. When she was a little girl, her mother, who was an alcoholic and a single parent, and she was an only child, would lock her in a closet when she went out to drink for the evening, and sometimes didn't get back until dawn, and sometimes when bringing men back would leave her locked in the closet. This little girl locked in a dark closet all night. Well, you tell me, what's a Honda like at night? Like a little closet, isn't it? Yeah. What?
I have a Honda.
You have a Honda. So you know. But it's true, isn't it? It's a little box, right? A little like, and what she didn't know was the little girl in her was coming to the fore and was terrified in the present moment. You see. And she hadn't made that tie-in. Well, then we discovered another thing. She had raised some very stalwart kids. You know, they had been an outward bound and upward thrust and all those other things that, you know, create courage. And I mean, they were real powerful kids. And she was very proud of them. And in fact, she had taught them not to be afraid of snakes. And she, you know, dreaded snakes, but they'd bring a snake. Oh, wonderful little snake, you know. She was not going to have her kids scared. And she did a beautiful job on raising almost fearless kids. But here she was, terrified about driving at night. That came up in the first session. So you know what we did? We got her to utilize that wonderful parent in her that helped her children not to be afraid, to mother that scared child in her, so that she could raise that scared child into an unafraid adult. How about that? It was wonderful. That's what I like doing my work for, see. Many of us have the resources we need to cope successfully, but like this woman, are unaware of it. We use them for other people, but we don't use them for ourselves. And so that part of her that was in a panic, was not coping well with this particular situation, we simply brought under the control of that part of her which knew very well how to conquer fear and how to talk oneself out of being scared. Am I making sense to you? Oh, good. I like making sense. All right. What we're talking about there then is a certain self-awareness. We don't mean self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is an impediment to effective functioning too. People who are self-conscious are the people who are saying, oh my, should have polished my shoes. I'm not wearing the right tie. Oh my, they won't like me. Oh my. And they're all focused only on themselves in that sort of way, thinking everybody else is judging them, when in fact nobody's paying any attention. But, yeah. But self-awareness is when I check out where something's coming from that I don't like. Or when I check out what's going on in me. Now, many people flee that, you see, getting in touch with their feelings, being aware in that sense. We even build barriers. Fritz Perls, who was a rather nasty old man, but a genius of a therapist, Fritz Perls once said we had a cliché level of personality. And the cliché level of personality is where I say, how you doing? And you say, fine. And you're not fine at all. You just say it because that's what you are expected to say. In fact, if you say, well, I could be better, then I walk away because I don't want to hear about that. I've got enough of that. But the cliché level of personality we use a lot, and we need to use it because you move in a large society and you meet a lot of people with whom you're not going to be intimately acquainted, and you say thank you to the waiter or waitress, and how are you this morning, and so on. And it's all sort of, we exchange these clichés, but we don't really get to know one another, you know. Kind of like in the elevator this morning in my hotel. Elevators are real interesting places. Everybody gets in, and they look at the numbers. It's a perfect example of a collective, which is a place where nobody counts. You know, nobody matters to anybody else, and they don't want to. If the cord broke and you were plummeting downward, nobody'd say goodbye. That's another part of that world where we move in a sort of cliché behavior pattern. Okay. Now, there's another layer of personality that we have. I like this schema, and that's the social role layer. And in the social role layer, that's where we meet in our function. You're the butcher, and I'm the customer, and that's the way we meet, right? And you do your job, and I do mine, paying for the meat, whatever. Or I'm the therapist, and you're the client, and I have to meet you in my role as therapist, right? And if you have, if the minister or rabbi or priest is officiating at a religious service, we want him to behave like he's doing that. In other words, not like he's at a barbecue or something, okay? Because that's a different social role, okay? And we all have social roles. Now, one of the problems, and the reason I'm going into this at this point, is that some people never get beyond that to the authentic me. Some people, there's a layer here that Fritz Perls called the death layer, and which I prefer to call the implosion layer, because you see, it's a lot of our energy is used to hold us back, because if you knew me as I really am, you wouldn't love me attitude, you see. And also, I even can keep myself so deadened to myself and my own sensibilities and what's really going on with me and where I'm coming from that I become a stranger to me. Okay? Now, a lot of people keep themselves from this sort of awareness because they just live on these two levels. And I meet them regularly in therapy. Very often in the divorce crises, what we discover, I have the wonderful experience regularly of introducing people to one another who've been married for 22 years. And why? Because they got wrapped up in playing games with one another. He was being husband as he thought husband was supposed to be, and she was being wife as she thought wife was supposed to be, and they were living out that social role, but they were terrified of meeting as persons. So that recently in a divorce crisis, a guy's going to leave his wife for another lady, horror of horrors, an older woman. I thought that was significant. I mean, that's really a slam, isn't it? Going to leave you for an older woman. And his wife said, you haven't, they've been married years, 15, 16 years. You haven't even begun to know me. You haven't even scratched the surface of me. What was she saying? She was saying, we've been living here, playing games. See? It's really unfortunate that many people wait for a crisis to blast them through this. Okay? But when this, we can do it otherwise, and that's what we before the day is over, I think that'll all be clear. But the energy that is in here, that is me, authentically me, when this does break, the energy that's been holding me back, plus the energy that is really me, comes out, and no matter what the social role I'm involved in, and a lot of them I'm involved in, or the cliche situations I may be involved in, it's authentically me that's involved. You still with me? Okay. And boy, it saves a lot of energy. Okay. I just got back from Australia a couple weeks ago. They were very nice to me in Australia. In spite of the fact that I said most Australian men, like most American men, were obsolete. Yeah, we're not breeding men for the current age. They're not grown up enough to meet the women. And we'll talk about that in a relational thing, maybe. And I had occasion to talk to a large gathering of marriage counselors in Australia and family therapists. They were holding their convention, and they kind of moved it so that I could talk to them. Okay. And because I was going to be there. They were wonderful. And one of the things I talked about to them is crucial for everybody, whether they're therapists or not. I pointed out that what was really crucial to effectively coping in this world was that you and I learn how to do what it is we are doing. Now, if you think about that a little bit, you'll discover that most of us are very seldom ever doing what it is we're doing. And when a therapist isn't doing what he's doing, then he really isn't doing good therapy, because good therapy is definitely paying attention to the person in front of one. Okay? Now, doing what it is we are doing means that if I am talking with you or listening to you, that's what I'm doing. And I'm not doing it to get to the next thing I got to do. If I'm reading this book, that's what I'm doing, and I'm not doing it because I've got to get to this other book. If I'm driving down the freeway, that's what I'm doing, and I'm not doing it because of something I got to do this evening or whatever, you see? You still with me? Most people are never doing what it is they're doing. And one of the ways they maintain the role-playing situation in their marriages is they never talk to one another. See? They may talk, but they're not doing what they're doing. They're bouncing off one another in the hallways or wherever, in the bathroom or whatever it is, boom, boom, and they're never really, you know. Okay. There are lots of marriages that would be 1,000,000% improved if he would look in her eyes and say, hello, anybody there? How are you? I had a new thought yesterday, and I was wondering if you've had a new feeling or thought today. You know, I mean, that's called intimacy. See? Actually taking a few minutes and paying attention to somebody. Very few people do that. But it's also true in terms of whether the minor functions, the major things we do, the encounters with persons, or the little details we have to do, whether it's doing the dishes or not. If we're doing what it is we're doing, we bring to it ourselves at that moment, and we focus on that, and it becomes a thing that gets all of our energy at that moment, 100% of us. We're not frazzled, and we're not constantly rushing into the future and wondering where our life is going. See, because this is it. I was recently in a Midwestern city, and they marched me into a Catholic school. They had 1,800 kids in this inner city school, and they marched them into the gymnasium. They were lining them up in the gymnasium. A lot of these were tough kids. They were sent there to be disciplined. And give them some discipline. And they were marching them in, and they were doing this. to get the troublemakers separated and things like that. And then when I was introduced and they were about to begin, then the wardens had their backs to me as they watched the kids because they didn't want them to disgrace the school in front of the august guest. And I got up and I said I'd been thinking of what it was, you know, what it could be that I could share with them that would be worthwhile. And then I got up and I said, I'll bet you some of you are freshmen and you've heard in your freshman orientation class that you're here to prepare for life. And they looked at the wardens to be sure that it was okay. They kind of nodded. And then I said, some of you are sophomores or juniors, and you've heard for 2 or 3 years that you are here in school to prepare for life. And more heads nodded. I said, and some of you have been here 4 years, and you're probably sick and tired of hearing that you're here preparing for life. And they went, yeah, amen, right on. Well, I said, well, I'm here today to tell you that the notion that you are here to prepare for life is pure, unadulterated bullshit! And they wondered, what they had unleashed. And I said, I want you all to take your right hand and take the left wrist of the person sitting beside you and feel for the pulse. Is anybody here sitting next to a cadaver? There was not one person in that hall sitting next to a corpse. They were all alive at that moment. They weren't preparing for anything. This was it. And it's the same for us. And I pointed out to them that statistically speaking, given that number of people, 2 of them would be dead of drug overdoses by June, 2 of them would be dead from drunken driving accidents by June, 2 of them would be dead from other causes by June, minimal. And their pictures would be in the yearbook as deceased in memoriam, and therefore this was it. And the whole idea that some of us get, that somehow today is a rehearsal, you know, instead of this is it, I'm spending my life with you right now. This is all I got. And that whatever we're doing it to get on to the next thing we got to do. We got to do this and must do that and all of this, and we're constantly in this rush. And so we never do what it is we're doing. That's why when we say things like about the guy who can cope or the gal who can cope, we say, well, if you have something you really need doing, that really needs doing, give it to somebody who's really busy, you know, the busy person. Why? What we mean is not the swamped person, we mean the person who gets a lot done. How do they get a lot done? Because they do one thing at a time. They do what it is they're doing. And each thing they do well. And then it's done and they move on to the next thing. They get to do that. But most of us frazzle ourselves and we don't cope very well because of that reason. Okay. I mentioned telling this to the gathering in Australia because I had a young man come up to me, a therapist, and with about 10 people around, so it wasn't a private conversation, so I can share it with you too, he started to cry. And he said, you know, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I have finally met somebody who'll understand what happened to me. And he said, 18 months ago, I got up one morning, and when I woke up and was lying in bed and could feel the sunshine coming through the windows, that's what I was doing. And when I put on my shoes, that's what I was doing. And when I brushed my teeth, that's what I was doing. And when I drove to work, that's what I was doing. And when I was talking to a client, that's what I was doing. When the phone rang and I answered the phone, that's all I was doing. And he said, and it just increased. And he said it was the most wonderful, the most peaceful, the most beautiful experience of my life. And it went on for 2 months. He said, and I had this warm, wonderful feeling in my tummy and this warm feeling in my head. Right here, it just felt so great. And I said, of course, your stomach wasn't tangled up with all the things you got to do this, got to do that. Well, I'm worrying about that. And your head wasn't tangled up with beating yourself with all the things you hadn't done yet. And he said, right. And he said, it was so powerful. It was so wonderful. It was like a 2-month orgasm. It just went on and on. It was beautiful. And everything was as important as everything else because I was doing it. If I was doing it, that made it valuable. And he said the littlest thing and the biggest things, they were all perfect because they were what I was doing. And I was all there, whether I was listening to somebody, talking to somebody, taking a shower, whatever it was beautifully enjoyable. The sacrament of this present moment is what is really crucial if we're going to learn to cope successfully. and keeping the present moment clear. A number of months ago, now it's about, I guess it was a year ago now that I think about it. Time goes so fast, you know, when you're enjoying your life. My son, Christopher, whom some of you know about, Christopher is 18 and a half years old. He lives with me. He awakens me every morning and has done so ever since his mother died. He wakens me every morning with the morning newspaper, a cup of coffee prepared the way I like it, and a hug before he goes to school. And he's a beautiful young man. And one Saturday morning, I was looking for a paper punch, and I could not find the paper punch in my office, which is where it's supposed to be. So I ran upstairs and I pounded on Christopher's door, who was sleeping late, it being Saturday, and I heard him say, "Rah, rah," and I went into his room and I said, "Have you seen the paper punch?" And he said, "No, I haven't seen the paper punch. What a way to wake me up." You know. And I said, "Okay, I just wanted to check," and I charged out. Well, after my first client left, Christopher was heading into the bathroom, and he said, "That was a rude way to waken me. I don't waken you that way." And he was really snarly. And I said, "I apologize again for awakening you so rudely. You're quite right." And I went and I saw another client. Came out from that client, and Christopher passed me in the hallway and said, "Yeah, I don't waken you that way. That was really a rude way to waken me." Yeah. And I said, "I apologize again." And then I came down and I got the mail, and I was looking at the mail, and I went into the kitchen to pour a cup of coffee, and somebody I knew had died in the Midwest, and I was reading this, and Christopher was having a cup of tea in the dining room, and he shot a little, stinger at me. It was sort of, and I was I'm not making excuses, but I was kind of preoccupied, so I shot one back. I went, "Ruh!" And he went, "Ruh!" And I went, "Ruh!" And he went, "Zap!" And I went, "Zing!" And he went, "Zong!" He's going to have the last word. See, he's a Barbeau. He's a real tough customer. And, well, I couldn't take this anymore. I got impatient with it, so I walked over to him and I said, towering above him, you see, I said, "You seem determined to engage in a power struggle with me. That is not done, because I have absolute power. And if you open your mouth again this morning, I will crush you absolutely." And I walked away into the kitchen, and he, knowing that I never threatened, he picked up his teacup and he went out to the gazebo in the backyard and sat down. And I looked out the window at my son sitting there looking unhappy. Now, here's why I'm telling you this. I don't like what that does to me. My gut was in... So I went out, you see, and I sat down beside him, and I said, "Christopher, I apologized 3 times for awakening you so abruptly this morning. And I now want to apologize for the inanity of my exchange with you just now. I just remembered I'm a nationally recognized authority on family communication." And I said, "But I was preoccupied and not ready to deal with that at the moment. I was elsewhere." And I said, "But the thing is, I have a hunch you are disturbed about something other than my rude awakening of you. And so let's talk about that." And he said, "You know, that's the first argument we've had in 3 years." And I said, "That's true, and I put the last one on film and made you famous. I may do the same with this one," and I just did. You know, I said, "But I'm really concerned." He says, "Oh, it's nothing." I said, "It's not nothing if it's causing me to have gut problems at the moment and you to be distressed. So tell me what's up." and he began to cry, and he began to tell me what had been troubling him for a few weeks. And we had a wonderful dialogue, and we went on a picnic, and we rode the carousel in Golden Gate Park, which everybody should do. You know, you should ride a carousel at least once every month or two, just for mental health reasons. Wave at the little kids. Good idea. Set a good example for them in the right way. Anyway, my point about it is that coping success, for many of us, don't do that. What we do then is we hang on to our anger, or we hang on to our upset, and that little pipsqueak talk to me, and we maintain that estrangement, and I don't like to stay in that state with anybody for very long. I want to clear it up because I could be dead in a minute. See, and I like to be current. I like to be current. I want to stay right on top of it because of the way it makes me feel. I feel good about that, okay? More than what it does for other people. All right, even, see, because I can't do anything for other people you don't do for yourself. And what I want to do is to mention that one of the things we have to do is to check out where our feelings are coming from, try to tackle those directly. Now, in our culture, unfortunately, most men have been educated out of being in touch with their feelings. They were told that that was sissy, that was being like their sister. We've always given permission to women to be in touch with their feelings and express their feelings. We call this being hysterical. But males, and this is what I meant by that offhand remark earlier, which wasn't so offhand, many of our males, you see, find they feel it's almost unmanly to have certain kinds of feelings. So they'll mask feelings of disappointment or feelings of fear with anger or with upset or with, I'm going to tough it out, you see. Well, John Wayne's dead. And so he's also dead in the culture, you see, in terms of as a model. And it's really crucial for us to begin appreciating that we get in touch with our feelings. So where does this feeling come from? Does it come from something that happened when I was a child? If so, is it still appropriate for me now as an adult? Where am I attributing to you a feeling you don't have? See, you don't care about me at all, you see, when what I really mean is I'd like to hear from you right now. We're going down the hall, and I pass you, and I say hi, and you don't say hi back. And I say, oh, my God, he hates me, and he's going to fire me today, and so on and so forth. And what happened was your dog got ran over today, you know, and you're preoccupied. It may have nothing to do with me. That's self-consciousness when I keep attributing things to you that may not be true. It's much better for me to check them out. Still with me? Okay. I want to read you one final thing, and then we'll conclude and take a break and come back and talk about coping with others. And the final thing I want to read you is an extrapolation from, or an expansion of, a letter written by an 85-year-old woman named Nadine Stair in Louisville, Kentucky. And she wrote, if I had my life to live over, I'd make more mistakes next time. I would relax. I would limber up. I would be sillier than I have been on this trip. I know of very few things I would take seriously. I would worry less about what others thought of me, and I would accept myself as I am. I would climb more mountains, swim more rivers, and watch more sunsets. I would eat more ice cream and fewer beans. I would watch less TV and have more picnics. I would have only actual troubles and very few imaginary ones. I would feel sad, not depressed. I would be concerned, not anxious. I would be annoyed, not angry. I would regret my mistakes, but not spend a lot of time feeling guilty about them. I would tell more people that I liked them. I would touch my friends. I would forgive others for being human, and I would hold no grudges. It's really crucial for competent coping that we understand that we're human, and that we make mistakes, and that we learn to forgive ourselves. Okay? I would play with more children and listen to more old people. I would go after what I wanted without believing I needed it, and I wouldn't place such a great value on money. You see, I'm one of those people who lived cautiously, sensibly, sanely, hour after hour, day after day. Oh, I've had my moments, and if I had it to do over again, I'd have a lot more of them. In fact, I'd have nothing else, just moments, one after another, instead of living so many years ahead of each day. I have been one of those people who never went anywhere without a thermometer, a hot water bottle, a gargle, a raincoat, and a parachute. If I had it to do over again, I would go more places, do more things, and travel lighter than I have. I would plant more seeds and make the world more beautiful. I would express my feelings of love without fear. If I had my life to live over, I would start barefooted earlier in the spring and stay that way later in the fall. I would play hooky more. I wouldn't make such good grades except by accident. I would ride on more merry-go-rounds. I'd pick more daisies, and I would smile because I would be living free.